people could grab their seats, please, and I'd like to welcome Alistair and Garth. Good morning, guys, and welcome. And just microphones, please, and we're into it.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, and I'm an engineer. It's a bit embarrassing. All right, well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to present our annual results and to talk about the future. And I will apologise in advance to the people who came to the Institute of Directors breakfast session. Yeah, Peter, you can both snooze through at least the introduction. It's worth acknowledging again that last year was a tough year for the port. It was tough from a people perspective. We lost our Chief Financial Officer, John Matheson, to cancer. Chris Bain, who had been our Chief Operating Officer, resigned. And these two senior people leaving left a very, very significant hole in an organisation that was already stressed. And then to top it all off, you'll be well aware that John Shasky, who was a hugely respected director, also had to resign for health reasons. So it was a tough year. And it did have a bit of an upside in that we got two new people into the senior management team. We got Gareth Jones, who joined us to be our container terminal manager. Very, very experienced professional container terminal manager from the UK. And we got Christian Lee as our Chief Financial Officer. Again, hugely experienced person in major infrastructure businesses, has worked in pretty well all around the world, but significantly in Russia and in the UK. And he's come here and joined us just recently. He is, despite his significant international experience, from Hamoana. And so that was the people side, but it was also a challenging year in terms of the performance expectations, because if we go back 18 months, you will recall the challenges that we faced at the port. We had a significant number of empty containers that were dumped, and really dumped is the only word I can use, dumped late and in unprecedented volumes, and we are very space constrained. Coupled with that, we had an apple season that arrived early, and it was a big season, and we had very significant congestion. So the people of the region, quite rightly, were concerned, but we struggled to get through that process. Efficiency was compromised. Some containers were moved half a dozen times rather than being picked up and taken straight to shipside. There were massive backlogs at the gate, and tempers were getting frayed right throughout the region. So when we started planning for the year just past, we had to look at what was going to change, and it was clear that cargo volumes are going to continue to grow. Pip fruit plantings are at an all-time high, and I think there is huge optimism about the continued growth in pip fruit. We recognised that the seasonal peak was not going to go away, which is, it has its pluses and its minuses, but it does mean that we have to pretty well get ready for a huge spike each year, which occurs roughly about the same time, and then try and manage things through the rest of the year. But having more capacity than we need, and it's just a challenge that we will have to live with. And we also were grappling with the challenge that bigger ships are going to come. And the question is, how much bigger will they be? Will they be significantly different in length or in beam or both? And at what point will they arrive? So it led us as a board and as a management group to develop a set of investment triggers, which have significantly informed our thinking over the last year. And Garth will talk about these a little bit later. But it also led to or just underscored the realization that we had to invest to grow if we are going to position for the future, which seems a useful point to segue to Garth.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, councillors. The presentation today will just touch on the actual operating results that we've achieved. We'll also look at some of the issues for the year ahead, future development options, and certainly happy to take questions at the end from council. In a wider context, in terms of trade, the overall trade through the port was pretty flat. It's still just over 4 million tonnes. And non-containerised volumes, though, did drop from around 2.4 million to 2.2. And two key things drove that. One is lower log volumes being exported to China, and that's reflected in just about all the port results. But also we saw a change from pulp in terms of the method of shipment. Over 200,000 tonnes of pulp actually moved from break bulk back into containerised volumes. So that's reflected in our container numbers, where we saw essentially 16% growth, or over 16% growth, from 220,000 TEUs to 256,000. That's driven by two key things. One was a record apple crop, where we're now well over 20,000 TEUs. The previous record from the year before was 18.5. So that was strong growth, and also obviously pulp volumes, as I've already alluded to. Those results were achieved despite the significant loss of dairy through the rearrangements that Fonterra have done in their supply chain. And that's redirecting cargo that was coming here now to Tauranga. We also, though, picked up, which is a vote of confidence from people like Maersk, a full vessel exchange in September, where one vessel comes in, discharges the whole cargo onto the wharf, and then another vessel comes in and also discharges its complete cargo and reloads the first and then leaves, and the vessel previously that was out at sea comes back in and reloads the cargo. So they do a complete swap. It's normally either changing trade lanes, so it's services. One may be going to Europe, to North Asia. One may be going to Southeast Asia. So they're moving. One may be a 4,500 TEU ship and one a 2,500. So to get the right balance on each of the trades, they'll redistribute. The seasonal inconsistency that the chairman's alluded to is reflected here in the graph. The rolling red line reflects the rolling TEU volumes on an annualised basis, and the black bars are the monthly volumes. So even though we didn't have the same seasonal peak as the year before, it was still substantial, but you can actually see, though, that the shoulders of that peak are now starting to fill out, and that's obviously one of the aims. But I'll touch on that seasonal peak as part of the trigger mechanism for capital development in the future. In terms of vessels, just working through, over 650 vessel calls through the year. We saw an increase in cruise vessels this year, but currently we're predicting 45 for the coming year, but then bouncing back to 69 the following year. We also picked up the Maersk Northern Star service on a weekly basis, and so that's underpinned those volume increases in ship numbers, despite us losing log volume from vessels. Also handled one of the largest vessels to call on the New Zealand coast on a regular service. That's the APL Qatar, and obviously we've taken a booking, and it's been reported previously, for the Ovation of the Seas at 348 metres in the 2016-17 cruise season, and she's booked twice in that season. So in terms of the financials, just our overall revenues rose just over 7.5% to 72 million. And net profit dipped slightly from 13.4 back to the 12.9. 13.4 was a record for the port the year before. And our total assets lifted from 275 million to over 300 million. Our returns to our shareholder also increased to 7.4. Our debt now stands at 84 million, and capital investment during the year was some 34 million compared to 19 million the year before. And I suppose the question that obviously gets asked is, where did the 34 million go? You say it quickly and it sort of rolls off the tongue, but there were some significant projects that were put in place, or building blocks for the future. Yes? Yeah.
So that assets, that 300 million, is that the NTA value? The 300.
That's total assets, not...
Total assets.
Yeah, that's total assets.
Oh, okay, so it's total assets, so it's less the debt.
Yeah, you have to take the debt.
So, question on that, the 275 to the 301, is that because of investments, you've added that to the asset register, or is
Yes.
it about a revaluation?
No, it's investments that have been made. So just looking at those investments, obviously we invested in the new off-port container depot at the bottom end of Thames Street. We realigned the container gate and moved it internally. At the same time, we added an extra lane and obviously positioned ourselves now with pedestals where truck drivers predominantly don't leave their cabs and communicate directly to the gatehouse, and that sets ourselves up for pre-advising in the future. We added additional reefer capacity to try and match the volumes that are coming on stream from apples in particular. So we added 30% capacity in terms of our reefer. The new main office building was started, we commenced operation from that in September, which is pleasing. We also purchased the first of the New Zealand mobile harbour crane simulators. There's another simulator that will go into Auckland later this year, but that's a ship-to-shore simulator, not a mobile harbour crane simulator. We purchased 2 new Gotwalds, each of those around 6.5 million, so there's 13 million in itself. We sealed the log yard, again, and that allows us to stack higher and actually reduce the amount of bark that goes to landfill, because most of the bark that's now collected from the tar seal is reused. We did do some re-armouring of the breakwater, and the dredging program was also completed. So some significant steps in terms of the investments in the year. The Longburn Intermodal Freight Hub, which is a collaboration between Ports of Auckland and IcePac, also commenced in Palmerston North. Our average vessel exchange through the peak season, which is March, April, May, rose 21% from 38 moves an hour to 46 moves an hour. And the significance of these moves per hour will be seen later when we talk about some of the triggers for future development. Portpac in itself handled over 35,000 TEU now from that one facility. It's actually now handling 36,500 as of today. And truck turnaround time reduced some 48% from 21 minutes. And this is average, obviously, times that are recorded from GPS coordinates off the trucking companies themselves. Our hoist fleet grew 16% to 28 machines. And again, so that was 4 machines extra, but for each machine, if you're going to operate at shipside for 24 hours, you need 3 drivers. And if people in business, if you have 3 jobs, you actually need a 4th. So you need extra staff to actually allow that to be used productively. And Napier is continuing to be the 4th largest container terminal in New Zealand, and it's more than twice the volumes of Centreport. That's based on the numbers reported to the Ministry of Transport in terms of their data gathering. Centreport, which is Wellington. Oh, sorry, no, Centreport. I wish I could get anywhere close to Singapore. Sorry, it's the huskiness of my voice, Alan. Just in terms of some of those stats, these are ones from the MOT website, so they're commonly available, but it gives you an understanding of where we sit relative to the other ports. And certainly Auckland and Tauranga are by far superior to the other ports. But given we operate mobile harbour cranes, we're extremely competitive and sit in line, though, with the 4 other ports. So one of the questions is, where do we need to be to remain relevant? What should our target be? And in the year ahead, we're targeting 53 moves in the peak season for March, April, May. And that's significant uplift from where we were this year at 46. So we are expecting some significant gains, and there's a number of things that will drive that. First of all, it's a crane simulator that we've purchased that will allow us to increase the amount of training and development that we do with our existing drivers, also provide a faster template in terms of training for our new crane drivers that are coming through. But equally, the two new cranes also have faster cycle speeds. So combined those two aspects together, and we believe 53 is achievable in the peak season. At the same time, we've increased our full-time numbers from 210 to 243. We've currently, when this was written, I apologise, it was 488. It's actually, I think, 492 now without a lost time injury. So we've gone 12 months, which is a significant achievement to all our staff and their focus on health and safety. And obviously, if you actually divide through anything to do with a zero, you end up with zero. So in terms of the frequency rates, both for lost time injuries and severity, they're zero. So obviously an improvement from the year before. Sorry? Yeah, effectively. It's in terms of the year ahead, what we're seeing is that charter vessel rates are extremely low, most probably the lowest they've been for some time. So vessel owners are particularly disenfranchised with the way the current rates are. Bunker oil prices are also extremely low, and that's helping to offset some of the costs previously incurred. In terms of shipping lines, just what we're currently seeing, most of the container lines are under severe commercial pressure, and the overcapacity on the east-west trades have now moved into the north-south. And we talk about north-south, that's China to Southeast Asia and then on to New Zealand and Australia. To give you an indication of just some of those rates, and these are sort of generic rates, previously some of the rates southbound would have been $1,800 US for a 40-foot dry box, now at below $500 US southbound. To give you a northbound rate for a reefer, previously, say 3 years ago, an apple box would have been paying $6,500 US to take it to Europe, plus the add-ons like bunker adjustment fees and caboose, now rumoured to be around $3,500 US and dropping. So huge competition. Those freight rates are, I believe, unsustainably low, and something's going to have to break in terms of the overall system. There's merger discussions taking place as we speak. The Chinese government dictated that China Shipping and COSCO will merge, and so if you're an executive in one of those two companies, it will happen. How? Don't know, but it will happen. The three Japanese lines are rumoured to be in discussions as well, but the prospects of that ever occurring are remote, in my view, but they've obviously got some mutual interest in terms of ownership. The Korean government has also suggested politely that Hyundai and Hanjin should also merge, but again, not absolutely au fait with what's going to happen in that situation. And APL, which is one of the largest container lines in the world, is rumoured to be for sale. So again, a lot of uncertainty in the market in terms of what's potentially going to happen. For ourselves though, we're looking at record plantings in the area. If you're around Havelock North, Hastings and wider on the plains, there's significant plantings going on. And so that's going to mean additional reefer storage and capacity will be needed eventually through the port. Water exports have started and are predicted to grow strongly. We still are predicting further loss of dairy in the coming year. Wood chip exports are likely to be curtailed for a period just because of some of the reorganisation within Panpac and Carter's, and that chip most probably is going to be relocated into the North Island for internal use. And ports are under more competitive pressure. And that's just part of the nature with shipping lines, A, refusing any increases, but also wanting significant decreases in their rates and charges. So we're predicting a lower net profit after tax next year, and that's driven two things. One is that increased labour coming through and hitting us, but also the depreciation and interest on 34 million. We had the first impact of that from the 19 million the year before this year, but the full impacts will actually hit us in the year ahead. We're also, though, seeing Ravensdown start to use Napier for urea imports, and that's started. But we are, as I talked about, targeting higher crane rates and ship rates in the year ahead. GrainCorp will bring through new imports of caustic soda, and that reflects the change in volume that Panpac is now using in terms of their pulp manufacture, and that previously was roaded down to Panpac previously. It's now going to be imported. It's going to be held in a tank and then supplied from here out to the mill. Maersk are scheduled to bring in a large vessel, so suggesting not to get too caught up in the hype around that when it occurs next year. But it will be obviously promoted very widely by Tauranga. And we are increasingly focused on our investment in training and development for the year ahead, particularly around health and safety legislation. That new legislation comes in on the 4th of April. So we're looking at the better use of Vault. That's a reporting tool that we have. Basically, if it's trying to make sure that the information that goes into Vault is at a higher standard. We're also looking at dedicated work groups set up within each department to focus on some health and safety issues. Our worker participation agreement, which we already have in place, just needs to be enhanced to make sure it complies with the new legislation. And we're also looking at a wider engagement program, particularly around our directors, to meet their due diligence obligations under the new Act. So there's quite a few things that are just in the pipeline. We'll touch on some of the trade forecasts that drive where we think we'll need to be. And again, currently we're at 220,000 TEU. In 10 years' time, we think we'll be around 355,000 TEU. So that's only a 37% increase. In the last 10 years, actually, we've grown 80%. So it's quite a conservative estimate about where we may end up. In terms of bulk tonnage, we think our volumes will grow quite substantially over the next 10 years, and certainly in terms of logs being the key driver.
I hope that conservatism is just based on the financials, not on the actual operation, because I think it'll happen.
We do a number of scenarios. We have a base case, which is the conservative model, and then we run a growth scenario, which actually includes all the upside growth. So there's different scenarios as we actually work our way through. So
just my point is, I don't mind you having a conservative thing that you're going to pay us a conservative dividend over the next 5 years, but I would be a bit concerned if you were having that same conservative response to the growth, because it's probably 40,000 extra containers coming your way in the next 8-9 years.
Yeah, no, I'll touch on those triggers where we've decoupled them and certainly, from the financials. We'll talk about that. Excuse me. So in terms of bulk cargoes, we're seeing our log volumes currently at around 1.2, 1.3 million. They're predicted to grow to around 2.5 million. And most of that will all come on road through the various channels to the port. So that's something in the order of a 70% increase over that time frame. And we're also forecasting an increase in ship numbers. But you'll note that the ship numbers is actually at a lower percentage because we believe each ship will take more cargo than previously. So it's not a direct correlation. Just what that impact on dairy has been, we're previously around 260,000 tonnes of dairy. This year we're down to 160,000 tonnes, and we're forecasting in the year ahead that we'll be down to 60. So the full impact of Tauranga's and Katahi and the Maersk arrangements will see us lose more dairy volume. We're seeing WPI being courted by Katahi and that arrangement to move their cargo through Tauranga. The Chinese slowdown in the log market has had an impact on us this year, but that's starting to redress at the moment, and we're starting to see some uplift in pricing, and that's being reflected in volumes. And again, that supply chain rationalisation, the step changes that occur tend to be quite big and pronounced when they do occur. So also provide some context around the debate as well. In terms of water, we're forecasting quite conservative numbers in the year ahead. We're around 50,000 tonnes of water, which is only 2,500 TEU. And then next year we're predicting 100,000 tonnes and then 300 by year 10. New Zealand Miracle Water, though, if you've been to the opening, you would have heard them confirm that they were looking at exporting at around 750 TEU per month from next June or July. So that's about 9,000. So that's well ahead of what we've predicted. But again, whether they get to that level at that quick is most probably going to be debatable. It has to be driven by the market, and also obviously they've got two of their machines in operation. They need to bring the other 4 in, and how quickly they can do that will be the challenge. If you look at though what's consented, and if you actually work through the volumes, the New Zealand Miracle Water have some 900,000 cubic metres consented. That would equate, if they were to use all that water, to some 45,000 TEU. Now that's not consented in the next year, but that's consented at the end of their period. Equally, One Pure, which is at Awatoto, the plant is actually going into that facility as we speak. If they were to get to their full and use their full allocation, that's 20,000 odd TEU. And there is also One Pure currently exporting on a much smaller scale. So there's a lot of upside in water if it all comes to pass and is being able to be sold in the market. Obviously, the TPP agreement has favourable outcomes for apples, horticulture, wool, sawn timber and wine, and they will all have a longer term impact on the region, and that's a positive impact. Obviously, the Ruataniwha water storage scheme also needs to be kept in mind, because that a lot of the added value production from that land that will be irrigated will go into export and potentially through the port.
On the TPP, what do you estimate to be the growth in export trade if TPP was implemented and agreed? Sorry?
It depends. I don't have an exact number, but what it will mean is that the tariffs will effectively come off. So that means that the exporters will actually get a higher return for their product. So whether they then use that to reinvest in more production or just bank it is another matter. But I would suspect most farmers that will go to extra production. So I would think that it would be in the longer term at least a 10% sort of increase in overall volumes.
And I would have thought also that a reduction of tariff on timber products would see more timber pulled out of the region and exported. I would have thought that would have been a consequence, wouldn't it?
It would potentially see more go into value added rather than logs. Yes.
Okay.
Yep.
So it's quite interesting those estimates on water. They've probably got capacity, but the market, as we said, just on the horticulture from Hiratonga, and we're saying that we had the apple guy here at one of our meetings. He said 40,000. It's going to double, so he's an extra 20,000. Out of Ruataniwha, have you done an estimate? It all happens. The dam all happens. How many TEUs do you estimate coming out of there?
It's a little hard to get a overall view, but based on a conservative split, if you look at from the dam, if it goes into a third more intensive sheep and beef, a third into sort of more intensive horticulture, and perhaps a third dairy, I don't know. If all those came to pass, then I think we're currently estimating something in the order of about a 5% increase in our full volumes overall. So that's somewhere between 10 and 15,000 TEUs.
Okay, so
And that's total, because that includes the imports that go with it as well. There's packaging and other things that all make it up. So
say 15,000 containers, and a third of that you're saying is dairying. Because I'm quite conscious, that you get a corporation like Fonterra, they can just go like that and just ship them somewhere else, where our local boys tend to be more loyal. So in that 15,000, 5,000 is down to whether Fonterra like us or don't like us, or whether they do a deal with somebody else on a national basis and they ship them somewhere else. Is that correct?
That's potentially, yeah, you could see Fonterra redirect the dairy volume because it will be processed, though, most probably in Paeatua in terms of a milk plant, unless they decide the volume is sufficient to start one in the southern Hawke's Bay region. So that's, yeah.
Just a point of clarity, Garth, on something that Rex raised just before with regard to the food industry, and before you get too worried about that seasonal peak doubling. The target of the industry is not doubling the volume, it's doubling the value. It's not necessarily going to be a 100% increase in what you see.
No, certainly I think the volume numbers are about 70% in terms of volume and about 100% in value. So there's certainly an uplift in moving up the value chain in terms of the types of apple that are grown. So it's in terms of our forecasting, what does that sort of mean in terms of the port? At the moment, in terms of business as usual, we generally have a CapEx program of around 10 million a year. And if you work that through over the next 10 years, that's something in the order of $100 million. But if we were to go to a new wharf development, current estimates are that could be as high as 130 million, and that development would be spread over some 4 years. But that would be predicated on identifying a number of trigger points and also obviously needing a sustainable business case in terms of how that's actually presented. Just what does that current spend look like? If you look at the split over the next 10 years, there's about 3 to 4 million of compliance CapEx. We've got about 62 million of replacement CapEx. There's some capacity that we would need to build in as we grow anyway, and that's around 30 million. And there's about around 4.5 or 5 million of commercial. So all in all, it's around that 100 million. And that tends to equate with the depreciation spend that we're looking at over that period. So that just gives you an understanding. But the trigger points for some of the development work, obviously we operate over one berth, and so the speed which we can actually move boxes over that berth becomes quite critical. And in that sense, so the volume that we actually hit in our peak season becomes one of the trigger points. The terminal productivity, in other words, how fast we can actually move those boxes over that berth, becomes another. And obviously the vessel beam and length also becomes a trigger point in terms of future development and the triggers.
Any plans for gantry cranes at this point?
Not at this point. It is one of the options that the port would always consider, but at the moment, the way we're trying to configure, and you can see from those earlier numbers, even with mobile harbour cranes, we are still competitive with the gantry ports. But we do have a different way of operating relative to that. So in terms of container growth, we believe that as our growth, if it's forecast under the growth scenario, we will have a sustainable business case that can support a new development. The only challenge to that will be as a vessel beam or length becomes ahead of the volume. And that then becomes a much more difficult business case to support. And we will need to have serious discussions with our shareholder and ultimately yourselves about that future aspiration or impacts. Because if it gets out of kilter before the volume, then justifying it on basis of just one vessel alone once a week is far more challenging. Just looking at the triggers though, and
Did you have a question?
I've got a question. Given the increase in the volumes you've got going through the port, constrained space, have you given any further consideration to that idea that was promoted some time ago about an inland port at Whakatū? We had a look at that, and it was put on ice because it wasn't justified then. Is it now coming back into thinking as a possibility?
Yes, and it'll be on another slide later, but it's never come off our agenda. It's just been, it was moved down the list, so to speak. This graph highlights you can see the asterisk on the left-hand side shows where our current productivity is at 46 moves an hour. And if you overlay in the peak months our volume as we continue to go forward, if we can get our crane rates to 53, then we have a time scale of when we need to have that development in place. If we can get our rate to 60 an hour, then it obviously improves. Conversely though, if we fail to get to 53, then that brings some of that development work forward. So it is a trigger based on how successful we are in terms of moving boxes across the port. But bear in mind, this is the point where it's needed. So we then have to start the development or the consultation process and the build process significantly ahead of that. So if you allow 18 months in terms of build cycle, then we would need to go through the consenting process well in advance of that and start consultation early with a number of interested parties. So it just perhaps highlights the trigger. This graph, or not, this view here just highlights that the mobile harbour cranes can go out to 39 metres of beam. So that is some of the larger vessels that are likely to call on the New Zealand coast, and that's the sort of size that would take 6,500 TEU vessel that would be able to still call within the port confines. So it just gives you, there are some areas though where at the outside row we would struggle with the crane in terms of its current configuration, but would that be sufficient to justify going to a gantry crane operation is doubtful.
The number back there was 53 per hour, 53.
Yeah,
It seems
moves-
to me an
moves per-
unusual number, 53. What's the magic in that?
That's a number that we think we can actually achieve. So we think realistically that's where we will be able to, handle this time, February, March, April next year.
Just, councillors, I've just had people watching outside on television can't hear what's being said, so could you please just make more use of your microphone?
Just some of the development options, obviously with the quantum class or the Ovation of the Seas coming, we've struggled to have two berths that can handle two large vessels at the same time, and as a consequence we've been looking at putting that newer vessel into one berth. That would require us to do some additional landside bollards and perhaps even a dolphin. But the recent simulation work that's been undertaken by our pilots with the Royal Caribbean now identifies that we will be able to berth that on two berth. But to have the ability to still do two large vessels, we'll still need to look at some additional bollards on one. Notice one berth is only 250 metres in length, and these vessels are 348. So there's a little bit of overhang you've got to allow for. In terms of obviously reefer, we'll still need additional reefer going forward. Again, with the growth that's occurring naturally within the apple industry, we believe we'll need to add a similar number of reefer points next year or certainly the year after. And one of the issues with that is once we've completed that, we will need a major electrical upgrade because of in terms of transformers and the actual ring configuration that we have. We're keen to look at acquiring additional land in Thames Street to expand our empty depot operation. And at the present time, we are doing some pre-work around the resource consent that would be needed if we were to look at a number 6 development. So that pre-work is going on as we speak. Obviously, the crane, we're keen to develop the simulator into an internationally recognised training facility. We've had approaches from overseas already about when it would be available for other people to use, but it will also be available for other New Zealand ports that also use mobile harbour cranes, even though they're not exactly the same as our own. We're keen and of working with NZTA and obviously the Regional Land Transport Committee around traffic flows, and there's a major piece of work that's being done about port access at the moment, and that's out for consultation and review. And again, just with the volumes coming to the port, not only containers but also logs and other products, then we do need to be somewhat mindful of our location, and that Napier City will definitely be affected, but also the Hiratonga Plains as well. we're certainly going to need additional off-port land, and Whakatū becomes a key part of that for aggregation in the longer term. And just a comment here in terms of that we are working with Kiwi Rail, looking at what the options are around collapsible log bunks for a dedicated train, perhaps at some stage next year. And that would run from Wanganui through Palmerston North to here on a daily basis. So happy to answer questions, queries as we go.
Quick question on Whakatū. Have we land banked anything there, or where are we at?
Yeah, we land banked about 7 years ago, I suppose. We've got four hectares of land. It's between, it fronts onto Anderson Road, and it's between the Scales coal store and the TNG site. So we've got the 4 hectares at front. There's a rail siding into that area, but there's another 8 hectares at the back of that would suit acquisition in the longer term to provide enough scale.
Councillor Bevan.
Thanks, Chair. The vehicle booking system, Garth, that was contemplated, I don't know, a year ago, I think it might have been. I presume you've now introduced that?
Yes.
Is there still sort of resistance or nervousness?
Yes. Anybody being asked to pay $7.50 to book a slot, we think that's quite a critical component of the way we manage, though, the terminal, because that effectively allows us to manage the demand. And the challenge for us is, though, that with the transport industry, when we ran into problems with congestion, most trucking companies were getting 2 or 3 truck turns a day from the pack houses and in that sort of general Whakatū area. Now, under this booking system, they'll get 7 or 8 truck turns a day, but they're on charging our $7.50 at $15 plus. So it's a little hard to understand why some people have accepted that, would be fair to say, because in effect they're getting that through the extra truck turn and productivity of their truck. But that's outside our issues, but it makes it very sensitive, definitely.
I was hoping that you'd say they've all embraced it.
Can't say all embrace it. It will involve some of the larger trucking companies engaging perhaps additional administrative staff to manage their bookings with us, but certainly it should be enough to recover that from what they've on charged. But it is still sensitive at the end of the day.
Councillor Barker.
With respect to the log trade and Kiwi Rail, is the port doing any work on the railway line from here to Wairoa and Gisborne? Has it got any initiatives in that area?
The answer is we are in discussions with Kiwi Rail and have been for some time, as well, though, with involving the council as well, in discussions with Kiwi Rail about what the longer term future would be, and whether there is a workable solution to move logs from Wairoa to Napier on rail. Obviously that's in the pipeline. We're not an active, I suppose we're the recipient of it in some ways, but we're certainly there supporting the initiatives.
Further questions?
There's no recommendation here, but I think for completeness, I'd like to move that the presentation from the Napier Port positioning for the future be received.
And we have a seconder, Councillor Graham. You wish to speak?
Just to say thank you very much. It was just as interesting second time round as it was first, and I think you had an extra slide in there actually. It has been a difficult year for you, and yet you've come out with a very good result. And I think that a very thorough look at where we are for the future gives us a lot of confidence in the way that we're going forward, and the importance this dividend is, of course, to the council through HBRC. And thank you, gentlemen, for a very positive outcome.
Thank you.
You're all good. Other speakers? the motion, then all those in favour, please say aye. And against, carried. Thank you very